Knitting is enjoyable and simple, no matter what knitwear design you may select, simple, chic, or elegant. These are the convertible knitters. You can knit plating or Intarsia knitting with this carriage. We will show you how to knit these patterns after making 3 garments. We will make the garments with the carriage. Your knitting machine's outstanding feature is that the gate peg can be changed in a single motion, allowing you to select thin or thick yarns at random. This gate peg has a 9mm pitch for knitting thick yarns. When using the 9mm pitch gate pegs, you use every other needle. Place the carriage on the right side of the needle bed and then place all the needles in A position to change the gate pegs. To remove the gate pegs, push the buttons on the bottom of the knitting machine and pull the gate pegs towards you. To place the gate pegs on the knitting machine, insert them in the proper order, from the left side to the right side. When using 4.5mm pitch gate pegs, you use all the needles. Now, we will show you how to thread the yarn. When using a ball of yarn, pull the yarn from the center of the ball. When using a cone of yarn, use the yarn from the outside of the cone. Put the yarn through the rear yarn guide on the right. And then lead it through under the tension pin from behind and slide it into the loop side. Next, put the yarn through the take-up spring and clip it under the yarn clip to hold it until you actually start knitting. Adjust the arrow mark of the tension disc according to the yarn thickness. Before you begin knitting the sweater, you will prepare a tension swatch. The tension swatch is a test piece that helps you complete the work in just the right measurements. Plan to knit a swatch 40 to 50 stitches wide and 50 to 60 rows long with the same tension dial and yarn as the garment. Use a 9mm pitch gate peg here. The tension swatch needs a total of 40 needles, 20 on each side of the center. Now, push the needles to B position using the needle pusher one by one. Move the carriage across the needle bed to align the needles. Stop on the left-hand side. Now, return every other needle to A position using the needle pusher 1 by 3. Set the tension dial to 8. Turn the row counter dial in the arrow direction, setting it to 0. You'll be knitting in stocking stitch, so set all levers to N. Now you'll thread the carriage. Let's take the main yarn out of the yarn clip. Hold it like this and push it into the yarn feeder opening. Hold the yarn in gently and move the carriage slowly to the right. Once you feel the needles catch the yarn, you can release the yarn end. The yarn is now caught on the needles in B position, already completing the first row. Next, hold the cast-on comb with hooks facing the knitting machine and hang it over the loops evenly while pulling the yarn with one hand toward you. You can hook the yarn end under the yarn clip. Hang the claw weights to the central groove of the cast-on comb. Next, push the empty needles to B position using the needle pusher 1 by 3. Knit until the row counter reads 60. Make sure that you move the carriage at an even speed to give the yarn an even tension. It is important that the carriage clears the last working needle completely before you return it. When you have finished 60 rows, you can remove the weights and the cast-on comb. Break the main yarn and put it into the yarn clip. Hold the knitting in one hand and release it by moving the carriage gently. The released knitting, that is the tension swatch, is often stretched sideways. So, release the stretch by pulling it lengthwise a few times. Then, pat it lightly with your hands to make it even. Next, use a steam iron to press the swatch. Dry and cool the swatch for 5 to 10 minutes. With this tension swatch, let's calculate the number of stitches and rows needed for the garment. Place the scale in the center of the tension swatch. Mark off using pins 10 centimeters horizontally and vertically and count the number of stitches and rows in this space. In this case, there are 18 stitches and 24 rows in a 10 centimeter square. Next, let's calculate the number of stitches and rows for 1 centimeter. Therefore, there are 1.8 stitches and 2.4 rows in a 1 centimeter square. Multiply the measurement of the finished garment with these figures. Now, we'll knit a lady's crew neck sweater. We will start with the back bodice. This is the pattern of the back bodice. Place the carriage on the left-hand side of the needle bed. Make sure all the levers on the carriage are set to normal position. Set the tension dial to 5. Using the needle pusher 1x3, bring forward every other needle to B position between needle 43 on the left and needle 42 on the right. Push needle 43 into B position on the right side. Knit 1 row with the waste yarn. Then, hang the cast-on comb and the claw weights. Put the waste yarn end under the yarn clip. Knit several rows. Make sure that the carriage is on the right side when the knitting is complete. Knit 36 rows with the main yarn, double the length of the hem for a 1x1 mock rib. Using the 1x3 needle pusher, push the empty needles into B position to turn up the hem. Remove the claw weights and the cast-on comb. Open the latches of the needles. Pick up the first stitch of the first row worked in the main yarn with a one-eyed transfer tool and place it into the end needle. Following this, hook all the stitches in that row onto the corresponding empty needles. Now you have made the mock rib for the hem. Hang the cast-on comb and the claw weights again. Push all the needles into E position, holding the knitting against the needle bed. You'll now knit 74 rows to the underarm. Set the tension dial to 8 and the row counter to 0. Knit until the row counter reads 74. In order to find the correct placement of the sleeves, place a marker at both sides of the underarm. Place the cut end of the waste yarn on the needles. Knit 60 rows up to the shoulder neck edge until the row counter reads 134. Next, place markers on sinker loops between the 16th and 17th needles on each side to show the neck opening. Then, put the latchet tool through the sinker loop, place a piece of waste yarn into the hook of the tool and pull it. Push the tool up to make the yarn come behind the latch. Now, place the yarn end into the tool hook and pull it towards you. Knit several rows with the waste yarn. Now cut the waste yarn. And remove the weights and the comb. Move the carriage to release the knitting from the machine. The back bodice has been knitted. Next, we'll make the front bodice. Knit the front bodice in the same manner up to row number 112, where we will begin the neckline shaping. Set the holding cam lever to H. Push 48 needles from the left 43rd to the right 5th to E position. Do not knit the left shoulder. Hang the claw weights again at each end of the knitting. Set the row counter to 0. Knit 1 row. Here, cast off 3 stitches at the left end of the right shoulder. To decrease 2 or more stitches, use the transfer tool to transfer the stitch at the edge onto the adjacent inside needle hook. Bring the needle forward, pass the yarn through the hook and return the needle to B position. Now you have a new stitch. Repeat this movement. When completed, the last stitch has 2 stitches. Return the empty needle to A position. Next, you knit 2 rows and decrease 2 stitches. Repeat 1 more time. You'll then decrease 1 stitch every 2 rows. Repeat this pattern 3 times. After that, keep on knitting until the row counter reads 22. You have now finished the right shoulder portion. Make a few rows of waist knitting and remove the weights and release the knitting from the machine. The empty needles are pushed back to A position. Place the carriage on the right. Push 10 needles at the center into D position. Knit a few rows in the waste yarn and release this from the machine. Place the carriage on the left. Push the empty needles into A position. Hang the weights. Set the holding cam levers to N. Set the row counter to 0. Knit the left shoulder in the same manner as you did for the right one, but the work pattern will be reversed this time because you will be decreasing stitches on the right-hand side. Here's the completed front bodice piece. Next, we'll make the sleeves. This is a sleeve pattern. You'll start a sleeve cuff with the width of 50 stitches. Work in the same way as you did the mock rib of the hem. Knit 32 rows. Here's the completed mock rib of the cuff. Now, knit the sleeve itself, increasing stitches. Set the tension dial to 8 and the row counter to 0. First, knit 3 rows. Bring forward the needle adjacent to the end needle on the carriage side to B. Knit 1 row and then again push the needle next to the carriage side end needle to B position. In this manner, you knit 3 rows adding 1 stitch and knit 1 row adding 1 stitch on the same side as the carriage. Repeat this pattern until you reach the 28th row. Then knit 5 rows and increase 1 stitch on the same side as the carriage. Knit 1 row and increase 1 stitch. Repeat this until the row counter reads 106. Knit 5 more rows without increasing. The row counter now reads 111. The sleeve has been completed. Break the yarn, leaving a length of about 3 times the knitting width. Next, knit a few more rows with the waste yarn and release the work from the machine. Knit the other sleeve in the same manner. Now, the blocking and pressing for the garment pieces and sleeves. First, cut the last stitch of the waist knitting in the mock rib area and pull the yarn on the opposite side. It can be removed quite easily. Next, lay the garment pieces the wrong side up and arrange the shape and size. Fix them with pins and press, avoiding the mock rib area. Then, turn them over and press them gently. To give the mock rib a gathered appearance, gently shape the ribbing by gathering it together with your hand. Press lightly. You'll now join the right shoulders. First, push the needles for stitching the shoulder portion to B position. With the right side of the front facing you, fold the waist knitting towards you. Pick up the shoulder stitches and place them onto the needles. Then carefully hold the knitting against the needle bed and push the needles to E position. Next, hold the piece with the wrong side of the back facing you. Fold the waist knitting away from you. Pick up the shoulder stitches and place them onto the hooks of the same needles. When this work is complete, return all the needles to B position. This creates a single stitch on the hook of each needle. After making a few rows of waist knitting, you'll bind off the stitches. Put a tapestry needle through the left end stitch. Next, pass the needle through the stitches of the next needle and the left end needle. Repeat this pattern. Remove the knitting for the shoulders by moving the carriage and taking away the waist knitting. The shoulder has been joined. The neckband is knit like the hem knitting. Knit 15 rows of the 1x1 mock rib in the same way as the back, front, or sleeves, using the needles between 47 and 47. Push all the needles into E position. Set the tension dial to 4 and knit 1 row. Again, push all the needles into E position. Now we will show the proper way to join the neckband to the bodice. With the wrong side of the bodice facing you, use the one-eyed transfer tool to place the stitch in the left of the yarn marker on needle 47 on the right side. Place the stitch where the neck and shoulder meet on needle 15 on the right side. Place the stitch in the left of front neck on needle 47 on the left side. Pick up the stitches on the back between the shoulder seam and marker and place them on the corresponding needles. On the center of the front neckline, fold the waist knitting away from you and place the outside stitches on needles 21 and 12. Place the rest of the neckline stitches evenly on the needles. Push all the stitches behind the latches of the needles. Tension dial set to 6. Knit 1 row. Leave a length of yarn 3 times the width of the knitting. And break the yarn. Bind off all stitches with the tapestry needle. The neckband has been attached to the bodice. Join the left shoulder in the same way as the right one. Now, attaching the sleeves to the bodice. First, bring the needles for stitching the last row of the sleeve to B position. With the right side facing you, place the armhole stitches between markers evenly onto the needles. Then push the needles to E position. This time the wrong side of the sleeve is facing you. You'll now place the stitches onto the needle hooks. And push the needles back to B position to make a single stitch. Let's bind off all the stitches with a tapestry needle. move the carriage slowly to take off the knitting work. This work is all finished by removing the waist knitting. Now, joining the knitted seams. The parts, order, and direction of stitching are shown in the illustration here. First, let's place the seam edges side by side with the wrong side up. Beginning with the first row of the mock rib, join the seams, stitch by sewing down between the rows. Then, turn the knitting and join the pieces in the same manner. The side pieces will be stitched from the sinker loop, one stitch inside, up to the underarm position. You'll stitch up the sleeve seam starting with the wrong side of the sleeve cuff. Then, join the right side seam upward to the underarm. Join the collar in the same way as you would for the mock rib. The excess yarn produced at the beginning and at the end of the knitting, or when changing the yarns, can be sewn into the knitting itself. For finishing, press lightly, beginning with the wrong side. Do it carefully, particularly along the seams. Then turn the sweater over to the right side to press it lightly. Now we're going to knit a lady's V-neck sweater. In this step, we'll explain just new techniques. Use the 4.5mm pitch gate peg. First, we'll knit the back of the sweater. This is the pattern of the back bodice. Make sure that all the levers are set to normal. Set the tension dial to 4. With the waste yarn, cast on every other needle between 67 on both sides. Push the empty needles to B position. Knit a few rows ending with the carriage on the right. Next, arrange the needles to make a 2x1 mock rib. Bring every third needle forward to E position and then back to A position, so that the stitch drops off the needle. Work across the row in the same manner as before. Set the tension dial to 2. Set the row counter to 0. With the main yarn, knit 64 rows, which is double the length of the hem. Push the empty needles into B position. To turn up the hem, begin on the right side by picking up the first stitch of the first row worked in the main yarn using the transfer tool and place it onto the end needle. Now skip the next needle and place the following stitch onto the empty needle. Repeat this pattern until the end of the row. Pick up the last stitch on the left side and place it onto the end needle. Rehang the cast-on comb and the claw weights. Push all the needles to E position using the needle pusher while holding the knitting against the needle bed. Now, knit 120 rows to the underarm and decrease 7 stitches on both sides. To make the armhole, cast off 7 stitches on the right side. Knit 1 row. Cast off 7 stitches on the left side in the same manner. Knit 97 rows to the neck edge until the row counter reads 218. Place a waste yarn marker on the sinker loops between 22 and 23 on both sides to indicate the neck opening. Knit a few rows with the waste yarn and remove the knitting from the machine. Next, we're going to knit the front of the sweater. Make the 2x1 mock rib to match the back. Let's knit 120 rows in a cable stitch pattern to the underarm. Knit 1 row. And transfer the stitches of needles 38 and 31 on both sides to the next needle using the transfer tool. Push the empty needles back to A position. Knit 9 rows. The row counter reads 10. To make the cable stitch pattern, pick up the 3 stitches on the right with the first transfer tool. Then pick up the remaining 3 stitches with the second transfer tool and place them onto the 3 needles on the right. Next, place 3 stitches with the first transfer tool onto the 3 needles on the left. After this, push these 6 needles into E position. Then continue knitting, crossing the stitches at every 10th row until the row counter reads 120. To make the armhole, cast off 7 stitches on both ends as you did for the back piece. Now for the V-neck shaping, start with the right shoulder. Push the needles between 1 and 60 on the right side into E position. Set the holding cam levers to H. Remove the yarn from the yarn feeder and hook it onto the yarn rest of the needle bed. Press the carriage release button to remove the carriage from the needle bed and set it on the opposite side of the needles in E position. Knit a few rows with the waste yarn. Remove the knitting and place the carriage on the right side, and push the empty needles back to A position. Thread the main yarn into the yarn feeder and set the holding cam levers to N. Pull down the yarn and remove any slack. Hang the cast-on comb. Set the row counter to 002. Now, to shape the neck opening, you'll decrease stitches on the left while you knit. Remember to cross the stitches every 10th row. Knit 2 rows. And decrease 1 stitch on the left using the 2-eyed transfer tool. Knit 4 rows and decrease 1 stitch on the left. Repeat this pattern until the row counter reads 76. Then decrease 1 stitch every 6th row 3 times until the row counter reads 94. Knit 4 rows without decreasing stitches. 38 stitches remain. Knit a few rows with the waste yarn and release it from the machine. Place the carriage on the left side. Push the empty needles to A position. Now we're going to knit the left shoulder. Push the needles between 1 and 60 on the left side, except needles 31 and 38 to B position. With the wrong side of the front facing you, fold the waist knitting away from you. Pick up the stitches from the last row worked in the main yarn and place them onto the needles. After picking up all the stitches, unravel the waist knitting. Work the left shoulder to match the right shoulder. You have completed the front of your V-neck sweater. Now we're going to make the sleeves. First, cast on 74 stitches. Make the 2x1 mock rib in the same manner as the bodice hem. Then knit the sleeve. Knit 4 rows. The following method allows you to increase 1 stitch on each end at the same time. Place the end stitch onto the adjacent outside needle. Pick up the stitch 1 row under the second stitch and place it onto the empty needle. Continue to increase stitches until the row counter reads 64. Next, increase 1 stitch on each end every 6 rows until the row counter reads 172. Put a yarn marker on each end. Knit 11 more rows without increasing. A sleeve with waist knitting has just been made, leaving a length of 3 times the width of the knitting. Knit the other sleeve in the same manner. Block and press the bodice and sleeves as you did with the crew neck sweater. Joining the right shoulder may be done in the same way as the crew neck sweater. Place the stitches of the front piece onto the needles, skipping only those stitches adjacent to the cable knitting from the shoulders. Then, place the stitches of the back piece onto the hooks of the needles. And bind off all stitches. The neckband is knit in 2 separate pieces using the stocking stitch. Set the tension dial to 3. Cast on 70 stitches with waste yarn and knit a few rows, ending with the carriage on the right. Set the holding cam levers to H. Set the row counter to 0. Knit 1 row with the main yarn. On the right side, which will be at the center front of the V-neck, push 2 needles into E position. Knit 1 row and pass the yarn under the needle. This is a needle decreasing method practiced in partial knitting. This action is repeated until the row counter reads 12. Now change the tension dial to 6 and knit 1 row to make a folding line. Now return the tension dial to 3. Push the 2 needles which are nearest to the knitting B position back into D position. Knit 1 row and pass the yarn under the needle. Another row is knitted. This is a needle increasing method in partial knitting. Continue in this manner until the row counter reads 25. Remove the weights and the comb. Pick up all the stitches of the first row worked in the main yarn and hook them onto the corresponding needles. Push all the needles into E position. Set the holding cam lever to N. Set the tension dial to 1. After knitting 1 row with the wrong side of the bodice facing you, use the one-eyed transfer tool to pick up the stitches on the left neck edge and hook them evenly onto the needles. Push all the needles into E position. Knit 1 row with tension dial set at 3. And bind off the row knitted in the main yarn using a tapestry needle. Remove the waist knitting. Now we're going to make the second neckband piece. Cast on 114 stitches. Work this piece using the same method as you did for the first piece, but decrease and increase on the left side. With the wrong side of the bodice and with a reversed neck edge facing you, use the one-eyed transfer tool to place the stitches of the back and the right neck edge on the corresponding needles. Bind off the row knitted in the main yarn using a tapestry needle. Remove the waist knitting. Join the left shoulder in the same way as the right shoulder. Attach the sleeves to the bodice in the same way as the crew neck sweater. Joining the seams. The parts, order, and direction of seam joining are shown in the illustration. Join the underarm sleeve to the bodice using the mattress stitch. Mattress stitch side seams, sleeve seams, and cuff seams in the same way as the crew neck sweater. Finally, mattress stitch the central portion of the collar. For the finish, press the V-neck sweater in the same manner as a crew neck sweater. Next, we're going to knit a lady's cardigan. Now, we'll knit the back of the cardigan. First, we'll explain how to make a 1x1 rib for the hem. Arrange every other needle necessary into B position. Use the 9mm pitch gate pegs. Set the tension dial to 5. This number means 4 numbers smaller than the tension dial for stocking stitch. Knit a few rows with the waist yarn, ending with the carriage on the right side. Set the row counter to 0. Change to the main yarn and knit 3 rows for a finished edge of 1x1 rib. Pick up the right end loop of the first row worked in the main yarn and place it onto the end needle using the transfer tool. Push the empty needles across your work into B position using the 1x3 needle pusher. Set the tension dial to 7, 2 numbers larger than the previous tension dial setting. Next, you'll knit 19 rows of the hem. After removing the weights and comb, drop the 3rd stitch from the right end and unravel the stitches by using the tip of the latchet tool. Pick up the first sinker loop, skipping 2 rows. Catch the 4th sinker loop and pull them toward you to produce a plain stitch. Continue this way to the top, then hook it back onto the empty needle. Make plain stitches from the first row knitted in the main yarn every other needle. Rehang the cast-on comb and the weights. Set the tension dial to 9 and set the row counter to 0. Knit 74 rows to the underarm. Cast off 5 stitches on both sides. Knit 59 rows to the neck edge. Place waist yarn markers on sinker loops between 15 and 16 on each side of the center to indicate the neck opening. After knitting with the waist yarn, the back of the cardigan has just been completed. Next, you will knit the right side of the front. Push every other needle between 2 and 42 on the right-hand side into B position. and also push the end needles at both ends adjacent to the needles in B position. Knit the right side of the front in the same manner as the back. Make sure that both end loops are hooked on both end needles. After making the 1x1 rib, knit 74 rows to the underarm and cast off 5 stitches on the right end. Decrease 1 stitch on the left edge using the 2-eyed transfer tool. And place a waist yarn marker. To shape the neck opening, knit 4 rows and decrease 1 stitch on the left edge. Repeat this pattern 13 times until the row counter reads 130. Then knit 4 rows without decreasing stitches. 23 stitches remain. Work the left front to match the right front. Now you'll knit the sleeves. Use the same method to increase stitches as in the V-neck sweater. Make a 1x1 rib for the cuff by 48 stitches and 19 rows like the back hem. Set the tension dial to 9. Increase 1 stitch on each end every 4 rows 10 times, and then every 6 rows 10 times until 100 rows. Put a yarn marker on each end. Knit 7 rows without increasing. You have now completed the sleeve with waste yarn, leaving a length of approximately 3 times the width of the knitting. Knit the other sleeve in the same way. Now, you're going to make the neckbands, which will be knitted in the same manner as the 30-stitch 10-row 1x1 rib. Here is the completed neckband with waste yarn, leaving the length of approximately 3 times the width of the knitting. The 110-stitch 10-row button bands are made in the same manner as the neckband. To make the buttonhole band, knit 5 rows using 110 stitches. Decide the buttonhole position like this and make plain stitches. Transfer 1 stitch to its adjacent needle and leave the empty needles in B position. After knitting 5 rows, make the 1x1 rib. Here's the finished buttonhole band. The blocking and pressing of the front and back pieces and sleeves is done in the same manner as the crew neck sweater. Joining both shoulders can be done also in the same way as the crew neck sweater. Now, let's attach the neckband to the back, the button band to the left front, and the buttonhole band to the right front with the respective numbers of stitches required. Attach the sleeve to the bodice also in the same manner as you did the crew neck sweater. Join the seams following the order and direction in the illustration. Give it a final press for the finish. Unlike conventional carriages, this model performs both plaiting and Intarsia knitting. Pass the main yarn through the right portion of the tension unit and the plaiting yarn through the left side. Thread the main yarn into the main yarn feeder. Knit a few rows ending with the carriage on the right of the machine. Set the tension dial according to the yarn you're using. Now, thread the plaiting yarn into the plaiting yarn hole in a way so that it comes right behind the main yarn. At this time, make sure that the two yarns are not crossed. Move the carriage while holding the end of the plaiting yarn. Here's a beautifully knit fabric with the main yarn on the plain side and the plaiting yarn on the purl side. With Intarsia knitting, there are no long floats in the back of the fabric. Several colors can be knitted in one row, enabling you to create a variety of patterns in desired sizes. You can enjoy drawing a diagram of your own design. Now, you'll see how it operates and learn how to knit pattern fabrics using this design. Let's start knitting. Continue plain knitting up to the position where Intarsia knitting is ready to start. Cut the yarn. Thread the prepared yarns into the sinker. The yarns are different in sliding effect, even those with the same thickness. Select the most appropriate sinker holes to prevent the sinker from slipping off the yarn. Remove the carriage from the needle bed. Put the center two rubber wheels into working position and the two outer rubber wheels into non-working position. Replace the carriage on the needle bed. Set the tension dial to one number smaller and the change lever to Intar. Move the carriage once to align the needles from B to D position. When working Intarsia, always make sure that the latches are open. If you find them closed, be sure to open them with the transfer tool before laying the yarns. Begin at the side nearest to the carriage and working away from it, lay the yarns in the open needle hooks in accordance with the knit patterns. Move the carriage slowly across the needle bed, gently pulling the end of the yarns downward with your other hand to take up any looseness. Lay the yarns in the open needle hooks, crossing one over the other. Slowly move the carriage. If the sinkers happen to come up closely under the needles, slide them far down the yarns before resuming operation. Continue knitting in this way, laying your yarns according to your pattern chart. After completing Intarsia knitting, place the rubber wheels into the original position. Set the change lever to plain. Set the tension dial for stocking stitch. Now you can create fashionable favorites with Intarsia knitting.